I was a junior at Lincoln High School in Portland, Oregon, when this nightmare began. Our AP history teacher, Mrs. Crawford, had assigned us a semester-long project on World War II resistance movements worth 40% of our final grade. My group had spent 3 months researching the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, creating a detailed diorama, and preparing a comprehensive 45-minute presentation that we'd practiced dozens of times. The project consumed our lives. Ashley Martinez, my project partner, had become obsessed with historical accuracy. She'd spent weeks crafting miniature buildings from cardboard and plaster, hand-painting every detail down to the weathering on brick walls. Marcus Johnson helped us research primary sources, translating German documents we'd found in online archives. Jessica Chen created tiny figures representing real resistance fighters, each one carefully sculpted and painted to match historical photographs. We'd followed Mrs. Crawford's rubric to the letter. She wanted authentic materials, primary source integration, and creative presentation methods that demonstrate deep understanding of historical context. Our diorama was a masterpiece, complete with working lights, removable building sections to show interior layouts, and a soundtrack of period-appropriate music and speeches. The morning of our presentation, I arrived at school early to set up our display. The diorama filled an entire table, with accompanying poster boards showing our research process, timeline, and historical analysis. Ashley had stayed up until 4 a.m., adding final touches to the miniature synagogue that served as the centerpiece. Mrs. Crawford was already in the classroom when I walked in, eating breakfast from a paper bag and grading papers with a red pen that she wielded like a weapon. She was in her 50s, with greying hair pulled back in a severe bun and glasses that she constantly pushed up her nose while looking disapproving. She glanced at our project setup and immediately started complaining. "This is way too elaborate. This is supposed to be about learning history, not playing with dollhouses." I tried to explain that we'd followed her detailed rubric exactly, but she cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Put it on that back table out of the way. We're doing something more important today." My heart sank. We'd prepared for months. Ashley had missed her cousin's birthday party to work on the buildings. Marcus had given up his weekends to help us translate documents, but Mrs. Crawford seemed determined to dismiss our work before we even had a chance to present. "But Mrs. Crawford," I protested, "we signed up to present today. It's on the schedule you gave us." She looked up from her papers with annoyed eyes. Plans change. Real historians have to be flexible. What happened next still fills me with rage years later. Mrs. Crawford stood up and announced to the class that she was going to demonstrate real historical research methods by showing us how professional historians deal with conflicting sources and challenge their assumptions. She walked over to our carefully arranged diorama and started pointing out what she called obvious historical inaccuracies that any serious researcher would have caught. "This building is completely wrong," she said, picking up one of Ashley's meticulously crafted structures. "The windows were different sizes. The architecture is all wrong for that time period." She set it down so hard that part of the roof collapsed, sending tiny debris scattering across the table. Ashley gasped and started to stand up, but Mrs. Crawford held up her hand like a traffic cop. "Sit down, Miss Martinez. You need to learn that history isn't about creating pretty art projects. It's about rigorous analysis and accepting when your theories are proven wrong." Then she did something I'll never forget as long as I live. She picked up the entire central section of our diorama, the synagogue that Ashley had spent weeks perfecting, complete with hand-carved details and carefully researched Hebrew inscriptions, and deliberately dropped it on the floor. The crash echoed through the silent classroom, tiny figures scattered across the linoleum. The carefully painted buildings crumbled into pieces. 3 months of painstaking work was destroyed in seconds. "Real historians don't get emotionally attached to their theories," she said, grinding one of the fallen buildings under her shoe. "They adapt when presented with new evidence and move forward without sentiment." The whole class sat in shocked silence. Jessica started crying, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the wreckage of our project. Marcus looked like he wanted to punch something, his hands clenched into fists on his desk. Ashley was hyperventilating, staring at the destroyed synagogue she'd poured her heart into. But Mrs. Crawford wasn't finished with her lesson. She walked to the front of the room and announced that we were going to do a proper historical analysis, instead of wasting time on elementary school craft projects. She pulled out a cardboard box filled with what she claimed were authentic historical documents, photocopies of letters, photographs, and newspaper clippings from her personal collection that she'd apparently been saving for just such an occasion. "Everyone find a partner," she commanded. "You're going to analyze these primary sources and present your findings to the class. This is what real research looks like, not playing dress-up with dollhouses." The documents looked legitimate enough. Faded letters in multiple languages, grainy photographs of bombed buildings, newspaper headlines from the 1940s. But something felt off about the whole situation. Mrs. Crawford was too excited, too eager to destroy our work and replace it with her own agenda. That's when things went from educational disappointment to absolute terror. Mrs. Crawford had brought in what she claimed were authentic historical preservation techniques that museums use to protect old documents. She pulled out several small bottles of chemicals and announced that we were going to learn firsthand how archivists preserve fragile historical materials. "This is how professionals do it," she said, unscrewing the cap on a bottle labelled with warning symbols I didn't recognise. The smell hit the room immediately. Sharp, chemical, burning, like someone had opened a bottle of concentrated bleach mixed with ammonia. "Mrs. Crawford," called out Ethan from the back row, covering his nose with his sleeve. "That smells really strong. Should we open a window or something?" She actually laughed, a harsh sound that made my skin crawl. "You kids are so soft these days. A little chemical smell never hurt anyone. This is how real archivists work in the field. They don't run away from a little discomfort." But the smell was getting worse by the second. My eyes started watering uncontrollably. Amanda sitting next to me started coughing violently. The whole room was filling with this acrid, burning odour that made my throat feel raw and constricted. "I think we should really stop this," Jessica said through her tears, still upset about our destroyed project. "This doesn't smell safe at all." Mrs. Crawford's face darkened with anger. "Nobody leaves until we finish this lesson. You spoiled brats need to toughen up and learn what real work feels like. My grandfather worked in chemical plants for 40 years and never complained once about working conditions." That's when she walked to the classroom door and turned the deadbolt with a definitive click that echoed through the room like a gunshot. The sound sent chills down my spine because I realized we were now trapped. "Nobody is going anywhere until you learn to appreciate what I'm teaching you," she announced, pocketing the key with a satisfied smile. The chemical smell was getting stronger with each passing second. Ryan started gagging and retching at his desk. Amanda was covering her nose and mouth with her shirt, but it wasn't helping much. Several kids were moving toward the windows, but Mrs. Crawford had locked those too during lunch, for security reasons, she'd claimed. "Sit down, all of you," she barked at the students who were trying to get fresh air. "This is exactly the kind of soft behaviour that would have gotten you killed in a real historical crisis. You think resistance fighters could just leave when things got uncomfortable?" That's when Marcus, who'd been silent since watching our project get destroyed, finally stood up and faced her directly. "This is completely insane. Let us out of here right now." Mrs. Crawford's response was to pour more chemicals into a metal tray she'd brought from home. The reaction started immediately, bubbling, smoking, filling the room with even more toxic fumes that made my lungs burn with every breath. "Exposure builds character," she said, stirring the mixture with a metal spoon like she was cooking dinner. "My grandfather's generation didn't run crying to adults every time they faced a little adversity. They understood that suffering makes you stronger." Kids were coughing harder now, desperate gasping sounds that filled the room. Samantha was bent over her desk, struggling to breathe and making horrible wheezing noises. The skin on my arms and face started itching and burning where the chemical fumes touched me. "Please," Amanda begged, her voice hoarse from coughing, "just open the door. We can't breathe in here." Mrs. Crawford actually smiled at that, a cruel expression that I'll never forget. "You want to know what real suffering looks like? Read about the gas chambers in the concentration camps. This is absolutely nothing compared to what people endured in actual history." I couldn't believe she'd just made that comparison. Even through my burning throat and streaming eyes, I was horrified that she would compare her deliberate poisoning of students to the Holocaust. That's when Tyler, normally one of the quietest kids in class, snapped and tried to break the window with his heavy history textbook. The book bounced off the reinforced glass without even cracking it. Mrs. Crawford grabbed his wrist so hard he dropped the book and cried out in pain. "Destruction of property. That's an automatic suspension." "You're literally poisoning us," he shouted back, jerking his arm away from her grip. "I'm educating you about resilience and historical perspective," she replied calmly, as if nothing unusual was happening. The chemicals were reacting worse now, whatever combination she'd mixed producing thick, choking smoke that hung in the air like fog. Kids were struggling to breathe, gasping and wheezing. Sarah had passed out at her desk, her head hitting the surface with a sickening thud. Blood was dripping from Marcus's nose, bright red drops on his white shirt. "Look what you've done!" Ashley screamed, pointing at Sarah's unconscious form slumped over her desk. "She's unconscious! This is attempted murder!" Mrs. Crawford just shrugged, as casual as if Ashley had commented on the weather. "Psychosomatic response. She's fine. She just believes she's in danger, so her body is mimicking distress symptoms." Jessica ran to the door and started pounding on it with both fists, the sound echoing through the hallway outside. "Help! Somebody help us! She's poisoning us!" Through the small window in the classroom door, I could see Mr. Thompson from the math class next door look over at the commotion. This was our chance. An adult would see what was happening and get help. But Mrs. Crawford stepped directly in front of the window, smiled broadly, and gave Mr. Thompson an enthusiastic thumbs up, like everything was perfectly normal. He looked confused for a moment, then shrugged and walked away, abandoning us to whatever fate awaited in that chemical-filled room. The betrayal was almost worse than the toxic fumes. Another adult had seen us in obvious distress and just left. He'd chosen to trust Mrs. Crawford's fake smile over the evidence of his own eyes. Amanda collapsed next, hitting the floor hard enough that her head bounced off the linoleum. Her lips were turning blue, a terrifying sight that made my heart race even faster. Ryan was vomiting violently in the corner, the smell mixing horrifically with the chemical fumes. The room was filling with smoke so thick I could barely see the other side. "This is exactly how you build character," Mrs. Crawford said, casually eating another chip from her breakfast bag while students writhed on the floor around her. "My generation didn't run crying to adults every time things got difficult. We learned to endure hardship and come out stronger." Marcus wiped blood from his nose with his sleeve and charged the door like a linebacker, throwing his whole body against it with a crash that shook the frame. The wood groaned but held firm. 3 other kids joined him. Tyler, Ethan, and David, all of them ramming the door together with desperate strength. "Stop that immediately or you're all expelled from this school," Mrs. Crawford warned, but her threats rang hollow now. We were fighting for our lives. Nobody was listening to her anymore. Jessica grabbed a metal chair and started smashing it against the window. The glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern but didn't break completely. Each impact sent reverberations through the room. "Vandalism! You're going to pay for every penny of damage." My lungs felt like they were on fire with every breath. I could taste metal in my mouth and my vision was starting to blur from the toxic exposure. But seeing my classmates fighting for their lives gave me a surge of desperate energy. I stumbled toward the wall and grabbed the red fire extinguisher from its mount. It was heavier than I'd expected, maybe 15 pounds of metal and chemicals, but desperation gave me strength I didn't know I had. I raised it above my head and brought it down on the door handle with everything I had. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms, but the metal bent slightly. "Stop her right now!" Mrs. Crawford screamed, finally showing some emotion beyond cruel satisfaction. I hit the handle again and again, each impact bending the metal further. Marcus and Tyler blocked Mrs. Crawford's path when she tried to stop me, forming a human barrier between us. One more desperate swing and the handle broke completely, the metal pieces clattering to the floor. I reached through the gap, feeling frantically for the deadbolt while the sharp edges cut deep gashes in my arm. Blood ran down to my elbow, but I didn't care. My fingers found the lock mechanism and turned it. The door flew open and we poured into the hallway like water through a broken dam, gasping for clean air that felt like salvation. I collapsed immediately on the hallway floor, my lungs burning like I'd swallowed fire. Other students stumbled out behind me, coughing, bleeding, some unconscious and being carried by their classmates. Teachers came running from other classrooms, their faces shocked at the scene of students scattered in the hallway, many unconscious or vomiting. Someone was shouting about calling 911. Mrs. Crawford stood in the doorway of the smoke-filled classroom, still holding her bag of chips and looking annoyed that her lesson had been interrupted. "They're all being overdramatic," she called out to the gathering crowd of faculty. "This is just mass hysteria. I was teaching them about historical preservation techniques." The paramedics arrived within minutes and said Amanda was in severe respiratory distress. Sarah had chemical burns on her hands and face where she'd touched contaminated surfaces. 3 other students were treated for smoke inhalation and chemical exposure. The hallway looked like a disaster zone, with students scattered everywhere, some unconscious, others crying and coughing. Mrs. Crawford was fired immediately and escorted off campus by 2 security guards, but the real consequences were just beginning. 2 days later, we learned the full extent of the damage. Amanda's lungs were permanently scarred from the chemical exposure. The doctors explained that she would need an inhaler for the rest of her life, and her lung capacity was reduced by 20%. She'd never be able to run competitively again, which had been her dream since elementary school. Sarah's chemical burns required skin grafts and would leave permanent scars on her hands. 3 other students developed chronic respiratory problems that would require ongoing treatment. The psychological trauma affected all of us. Panic attacks, nightmares, anxiety around authority figures. That's when I realized that getting Mrs. Crawford fired wasn't nearly enough. She had to pay for what she'd done to Amanda, to Sarah, to all of us. This was about more than losing a job. This was about justice for deliberately harming children. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of disturbing behavior that the school district had ignored for years. Mrs. Crawford had been reprimanded at 2 previous schools for what administrators politely called unconventional teaching methods. At Roosevelt Middle School, she'd made students sit in painful positions for hours during a lesson about medieval torture. claiming it would help them understand historical suffering. Several students had passed out from the stressed positions, but the administration had only given her a verbal warning. At Jefferson High School, she'd refused to let students use the bathroom during a 3-hour endurance lesson about military training in World War I. When one student had an accident, she'd forced him to sit in soiled clothes for the rest of the day as a lesson about the realities of trench warfare. Both schools had quietly allowed her to resign and move on, rather than deal with the paperwork and publicity of firing her for cause. They'd written neutral recommendation letters and passed the problem to Lincoln High School, where we became her victims. My parents hired a lawyer named Patricia Hendricks, who specialized in school negligence and personal injury cases. Her downtown office was filled with law books and case files, the walls covered with newspaper clippings about settlements she'd won for other families. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases of educational malpractice I've ever seen," she explained during our first meeting, spreading documents across her massive conference table. Mrs. Crawford violated her duty of care in multiple ways: false imprisonment, reckless endangerment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. She explained that we had grounds for both criminal charges against Mrs. Crawford personally and a civil lawsuit against the school district for negligent hiring and supervision. The locked door made it false imprisonment, which was a felony. The chemical exposure was reckless endangerment of children, another felony. "Having 15 witnesses makes this a very strong case," Patricia said, organizing photos of our injuries and medical records. "Schools have a legal duty to protect students, and both Mrs. Crawford and the district violated that duty in ways that caused permanent harm." Amanda's parents filed the first lawsuit, seeking damages for medical expenses, future treatment costs, lost opportunities, and pain and suffering. My family joined as plaintiffs along with Sarah's family and 6 other students who'd suffered injuries. The criminal trial started 4 months later. Mrs. Crawford showed up to court every day in a conservative blue suit, trying to project the image of a responsible educator who'd been misunderstood. She pleaded not guilty to all charges and hired an expensive defense attorney who specialized in defending teachers accused of misconduct. Her lawyer's strategy was to argue that she'd been conducting a legitimate educational exercise that we'd overreacted to due to modern students being oversensitive and unprepared for real-world challenges. He claimed the locked door was for our own safety during the chemical demonstration and that we'd panicked unnecessarily. Mrs. Crawford was trying to give these students a realistic, historical experience, her attorney argued in opening statements. She was teaching them about document preservation techniques used in museums and archives. The students' reaction was disproportionate to any actual danger. But the prosecutor had done his homework thoroughly. He'd brought in expert witnesses from the chemistry department at Portland State University who testified about the chemicals Mrs. Crawford had mixed and their effects on human health. Dr. Michael Chang, a chemistry professor, explained that Mrs. Crawford had combined industrial cleaning solvents in a way that created hydrogen chloride gas, essentially the same chemical weapon used in World War I trench warfare. In an enclosed space without ventilation, it could cause permanent lung damage, blindness, or death. The defendant didn't accidentally create dangerous conditions, prosecutor David Walsh told the jury. She deliberately mixed industrial chemicals in a closed room with 15 teenagers, then prevented them from seeking help when they began showing symptoms of chemical poisoning. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the emergency room physician who'd treated us. She brought x-rays and medical charts that showed the extent of our injuries in stark detail. Amanda Rodriguez's lung scarring is consistent with prolonged exposure to corrosive gases, Dr. Martinez testified, pointing to the cloudy areas on the X-ray images. This level of permanent damage doesn't happen from brief accidental exposure. These students were trapped with toxic fumes for an extended period. She showed the jury photographs of Sarah's chemical burns and explained the skin graft procedures she'd need. The images were horrific. Red, blistered skin that looked like it had been burned with acid. Another 10 to 15 minutes of exposure and we might have had fatalities, Dr. Martinez said. Several students were showing signs of severe respiratory distress that could have led to complete respiratory failure. Mrs. Crawford's defense attorney tried to argue that she didn't know the chemicals were dangerous, claiming she'd thought they were harmless preservation materials. But Prosecutor Walsh destroyed that defense with evidence from Mrs. Crawford's computer. Her internet search history showed she'd researched the chemicals extensively before ordering them. She'd visited websites that clearly explained their industrial uses and safety requirements. She'd even read articles about using them to create realistic historical demonstrations that would shock students into understanding. She knew exactly what she was doing, Walsh told the jury during closing arguments. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. Mrs. Crawford deliberately chose to put her students at risk to prove a point about toughness and character. The prosecution also presented evidence of Mrs. Crawford's previous complaints at other schools, showing a clear pattern of escalating dangerous behaviour that school administrators had ignored. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict: guilty on all counts of reckless endangerment, false imprisonment, and child abuse. Mrs. Crawford's face went white as the verdict was read. She'd been so confident in her defence, so certain that her years of experience as an educator would protect her from consequences. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison, 3 years for the reckless endangerment charges, and 2 additional years for false imprisonment. Her teaching licence was permanently revoked by the State Board of Education. She'd never be allowed to work with children again in any capacity. Your actions represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in educators, Judge Patricia Williams said during sentencing. You deliberately endangered the lives of children in your care for reasons that defy understanding. But the criminal conviction was just the beginning. The civil case against the school district was where we could really make them pay for their negligent supervision. During the discovery process, Patricia uncovered a treasure trove of damaging evidence. Email chains between Mrs. Crawford and Principal Johnson revealed that multiple people had raised concerns about her teaching methods weeks before our incident. 2 weeks before the chemical attack, a student named Rebecca had complained to her parents that Mrs. Crawford's historical demonstrations made her uncomfortable and scared. Her parents had emailed Principal Johnson expressing concerns about the appropriateness of Mrs. Crawford's methods. Principal Johnson's response email made my blood boil. I'll talk to Mrs. Crawford about toning down her enthusiasm, but we need to remember that rigorous historical education sometimes makes students uncomfortable. That's how real learning happens. They knew she was dangerous, Patricia explained, showing us the email chain. The school had multiple opportunities to properly supervise or remove Mrs. Crawford, but they chose to ignore clear warning signs. More evidence emerged, showing that the district had never properly verified Mrs. Crawford's claims about her previous teaching experience. They'd accepted her resume at face value without contacting her previous employers or checking references properly. If they'd done basic due diligence, they would have discovered the complaints at Roosevelt and Jefferson. Instead, they'd hired someone with a documented history of endangering students and given her unsupervised access to classrooms. The school district's lawyers initially tried to argue that Mrs. Crawford was technically a long-term substitute teacher, which would limit their liability for her actions. But Patricia found her contract showing she'd been working at Lincoln High for 8 months, with her own classroom and full teaching responsibilities, hardly a temporary substitute position. More damaging evidence emerged when we learned about Mr. Thompson, the math teacher who'd seen us through the window and walked away. In his deposition, he admitted that Mrs. Crawford's thumbs up had seemed strange, given the obvious distress he could see. But he'd assumed she knew what she was doing. I heard students shouting and saw them at the windows, he testified under oath. But Mrs. Crawford seemed calm and gave me a thumbs up, so I thought it was just normal classroom management. When Patricia pressed him about why he hadn't investigated further, Mr. Thompson broke down. I should have looked closer. I should have asked questions. Those kids were obviously in trouble and I just walked away. His testimony revealed a broader pattern of willful blindness among the faculty. Teachers had heard about Mrs. Crawford's unusual methods, but had chosen not to investigate or report their concerns to administration. The school district offered us a settlement halfway through the civil trial. The initial amount was substantial, $2.3 million split among all the injured students, plus coverage for ongoing medical expenses and therapy costs. But the settlement came with a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent any of us from talking about what happened publicly. We couldn't give interviews, write about our experiences, or speak at educational conferences about student safety. Most of the families were ready to take the money. They desperately needed it for mounting medical bills and therapy costs that insurance didn't fully cover. Amanda's family was facing hundreds of thousands in future medical expenses for her lung treatments. But after family discussions and meetings with Patricia, Amanda's parents and mine decided to reject the settlement and demand a jury trial. We wanted the full truth to come out publicly, not hidden behind legal agreements. People need to know what happened here, Amanda's mother said at a press conference outside the courthouse. Other students shouldn't have to go through this because schools are more worried about protecting their reputation than protecting children. The decision to go to trial was risky. Juries are unpredictable, and we might end up with less money than the settlement offer. But we felt that exposing the full truth was more important than financial compensation. The civil trial lasted 3 weeks and received extensive local media coverage. Every day, reporters filled the courthouse gallery as witness after witness described Mrs. Crawford's dangerous behavior and the district's negligent response. The most powerful testimony came from Amanda herself. She took the stand, carrying her inhaler, and explained how her life had changed since that day in Mrs. Crawford's classroom. "I used to run track every day after school," she testified, her voice clear and strong despite everything she'd been through. "I was training for state championships and had college scouts looking at me for scholarships." She demonstrated how she now had to use her inhaler before any physical activity, even climbing stairs. The jury watched in silence as she explained her daily medication routine and the breathing exercises she'd need to do for the rest of her life. "Every time I use this," she said, holding up her inhaler, "I remember that teacher valuing her lesson plan over my ability to breathe freely." Sarah testified about her skin grafts and the ongoing treatment for her chemical burns. She showed the jury photographs of her scarred hands and explained how simple tasks like writing or typing were now painful. "My testimony focused on the psychological trauma and how it had affected my ability to trust authority figures. I described the panic attacks I still experienced in closed spaces and how the smell of cleaning chemicals could trigger flashbacks to that horrible day." The jury also heard from educational experts who explained how Mrs. Crawford's behavior violated every standard of appropriate teaching practice. Dr. Linda Foster, an education professor at the University of Oregon, testified about proper supervision and safety protocols. "No legitimate educational objective could justify exposing students to industrial chemicals in an unventilated space," Dr. Foster said. "This was not teaching. It was child endangerment disguised as education." After deliberating for 2 days, the jury returned with a verdict that exceeded our wildest expectations. They awarded us $8.7 million in damages, nearly 4 times the settlement offer the district had made. More importantly, the judge ordered comprehensive reforms to the district's hiring and supervision practices. Every teacher would now undergo thorough background checks that included interviews with previous employers. All classroom demonstrations involving chemicals or potentially dangerous materials required prior approval from the science department and safety officer. The verdict sent shockwaves through educational circles across Oregon and beyond. School districts statewide began reviewing their own hiring and supervision practices, afraid of facing similar lawsuits. The Portland Tribune ran a week-long series about our case that was picked up by national news outlets. The story appeared on CNN, ABC News, and was featured in a documentary about school safety that aired on PBS. Suddenly, parents everywhere were asking tough questions about teacher supervision and emergency protocols. School boards that had been cutting safety budgets found themselves explaining to angry parents why they thought saving money was more important than protecting children. Amanda and I started receiving invitations to speak at education conferences across the country. We travel with Patricia to different cities, telling our story to administrators, teachers, and school board members who needed to understand the real consequences of neglecting student safety. The speaking engagements were emotionally difficult but vitally important. At each conference, we'd meet other students who'd been hurt by reckless teachers, kids who'd been injured in character-building exercises, punished for medical conditions they couldn't control, or humiliated in front of their peers for educational purposes. "Every student deserves to feel safe in their classroom," Amanda would tell these audiences, holding up her inhaler. "When teachers prioritize their lesson plans over student safety, children get hurt in ways that last forever." We spoke at the National Education Association's annual conference, addressing over 3,000 teachers and administrators. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many educators thanking us for sharing our story and promising to implement better safety protocols in their own schools. Mrs. Crawford served 3.5 years of her 5-year sentence before being released on parole. Prison had not been kind to her. Other inmates didn't look favorably on someone who'd hurt children. She'd been transferred between facilities multiple times for her own safety. When she was released, she tried to move to Arizona and find work as a private tutor. But our case had created a permanent digital footprint that followed her everywhere. A simple Google search of her name brought up dozens of news articles about the chemical attack and criminal conviction. No reputable tutoring service would hire her. Private clients cancelled when they discovered her background. She eventually found work at a call center in Phoenix, far from any position that would give her authority over children. Her teaching career, the profession she'd claimed to love so much, was over forever. The state board had made sure her conviction and license revocation were entered into national databases that tracked educator misconduct. Amanda went to college at the University of Oregon on a scholarship funded partly by our settlement money. She studied education policy and child advocacy, determined to prevent other students from experiencing what we'd gone through. Her lung capacity improved slightly over the years with treatment, but she still needed her inhaler daily. She'd found new passions in swimming and cycling, sports that were easier on her damaged lungs than running. She started a non-profit organization called Students First Safety that pushed for stronger teacher background checks and classroom safety protocols. The organization grew rapidly, with chapters at high schools across the Pacific Northwest. I chose to study journalism, inspired by the reporters who'd helped expose the truth about our case. I wanted to investigate institutional failures and hold powerful people accountable for their actions. My first major article in college was an investigative piece about teacher misconduct in Oregon schools. The research revealed dozens of cases where dangerous teachers had been quietly shuffled between districts instead of being properly disciplined. The article led to state legislation requiring all misconduct complaints to be entered into a centralized database that school districts would be required to check before hiring. It was a small victory, but it felt like progress. Sarah decided to become a lawyer like Patricia, motivated by how powerful it felt to fight for justice through the legal system. She specialized in education law and personal injury cases, helping other families navigate the complex process of holding schools accountable. The three of us stayed in touch throughout college and beyond, bonded by our shared experience, but determined not to let it define our entire lives. We'd been through hell together, but we'd also learned that fighting back was possible. 5 years after the incident, Lincoln High School held a memorial assembly for student safety awareness. They'd installed a plaque in the main hallway listing new safety protocols and dedicating them to the class of 2019 students who showed courage in the face of danger. I stood in that hallway reading the plaque and thinking about how much had changed. Mrs. Crawford's former classroom had been completely renovated and converted into a computer lab. The chemical smell was gone, the windows opened properly, and the door could never be locked from the inside. New safety protocols were posted in every classroom. Emergency phone systems connected directly to the main office. Mandatory teacher training on recognizing student distress. Chemical storage regulations that required approval for any non-standard materials. Amanda joined me at the memorial, pulling her inhaler from her pocket as she always did when discussing that day. But this time she was smiling instead of looking haunted. "You know what's ironic?" she said, looking at the safety protocols we'd fought for. Mrs. Crawford wanted to teach us about resilience and historical suffering. She succeeded, just not the way she intended. We'd learned that real resilience isn't about enduring abuse silently or accepting dangerous conditions because authority figures tell you to. Real resilience is about standing up when someone tries to hurt you, fighting for justice even when it's difficult, and making sure they can never hurt anyone else. Mrs. Crawford had tried to teach us about historical resistance movements by showing us documents and artifacts. Instead, she'd turned us into resistance fighters ourselves, battling against institutional indifference and adult betrayal. Our destroyed diorama was never rebuilt, but in a way, we'd created something more important. We'd built a legal case that protected countless other students and proved that even the most dangerous teachers could be held accountable for their actions. The fight hadn't been easy. Court battles, depositions, media attention, reliving the trauma over and over again. But seeing those safety protocols posted in every classroom made it all worthwhile. We'd started as high school students working on a history project about resistance during World War II. We'd ended up leading our own resistance movement against educational negligence and institutional cover-ups. Mrs. Crawford had destroyed our diorama in seconds, but she couldn't destroy our determination to seek justice. That determination had led to criminal convictions, civil judgments, policy changes, and new laws that would protect students for generations. Sometimes the most important lessons happen outside the official curriculum. Mrs. Crawford had taught us about the reality of institutional power, the importance of standing up to authority when it's wrong, and the strength that comes from fighting back against injustice. We couldn't undo Amanda's lung damage or erase the trauma we'd all experienced. But we'd proven that students have power when they refuse to be victims and demand accountability from the adults who are supposed to protect them. The Destroyed History Project had become history itself, a case study in how determined students can fight back against dangerous teachers and win. It was a lesson worth more than any grade, and a victory that no toxic gas could ever take away. 10 years later, I sometimes drive past Lincoln High School and see students walking to class, backpacks slung over their shoulders, laughing with friends. They have no idea how much safer their classrooms are because of what happened in room 237 that terrible day. They don't know about Mrs. Crawford's chemical attack or the legal battle that followed. They don't know about Amanda's damaged lungs or Sarah's scarred hands. But they benefit from the safety protocols we fought for, the teacher training requirements we demanded, and the accountability systems we helped create. That's the real victory. Not the money we won or the media attention we received, but the knowledge that other students are safer because we refused to stay silent. The ripple effects of our case continued for years. Other survivors of teacher misconduct started coming forward, inspired by our willingness to fight back publicly. A teacher in Seattle was arrested for similar chemical experiments after parents read about our case and recognized dangerous patterns in their own children's classroom. In Michigan, a substitute teacher was fired before she could harm students when a background check revealed she'd been terminated from a previous job for unconventional discipline methods. The new databases we'd helped create were working exactly as intended. Amanda's non-profit grew into a national organization with over 50 chapters. They'd successfully lobbied for stronger teacher certification requirements in 12 states and helped pass federal legislation requiring cross-state reporting of educator misconduct. The organization maintained a public database where parents could report concerning teacher behavior and search for red flags about educators in their children's schools. It was exactly the kind of transparency we'd wished existed when Mrs. Crawford was hired. During her senior year of college, Amanda was invited to testify before Congress about education safety reform. She sat at a table in a packed hearing room, her inhaler visible on the table in front of her, explaining to senators how simple policy changes could save lives. Every student deserves to trust that their teacher won't deliberately harm them, she told the committee. When we fail to screen dangerous educators or ignore warning signs, we're essentially conducting human experiments with our children's safety. The hearing led to the passage of the Teacher Accountability and Student Safety Act, which mandated national reporting standards for educator misconduct and created funding for enhanced background check systems. Sarah's law practice had grown to specialize exclusively in education cases. She'd won settlements for dozens of families whose children had been harmed by negligent schools or dangerous teachers. Her office walls were covered with newspaper clippings about cases she'd won and thank you letters from grateful families. One case particularly stood out. A kindergarten teacher in rural Oregon who'd been leaving children unsupervised as punishment. When a 5-year-old boy was seriously injured during one of these episodes, Sarah helped his family win a settlement that forced the district to completely overhaul their supervision policies. Every case reminds me why we fought so hard, Sarah told me during one of our annual reunions. These aren't just legal victories, they're about protecting children who can't protect themselves. My journalism career had focused heavily on investigative reporting about institutional failures in education. I'd exposed cover-ups in 3 different states and helped parents understand their rights when schools failed to protect their children. One of my proudest achievements was a series about the long-term psychological effects of teacher abuse. I'd interviewed dozens of adults who'd been harmed by educators as children, documenting how these experiences shaped their relationships with authority and institutions for decades. The series won a National Education Reporting Award and led to increased funding for counseling services in schools. It also helped legitimize the trauma that students like us experienced, showing that "it's just school" wasn't an acceptable response to educator misconduct. Marcus had become a teacher himself, inspired by our experience to be the kind of educator he'd wished we'd had. He taught history at a progressive high school in Portland, where student safety and emotional well-being were prioritized alongside academic achievement. His classroom was a model of what education could be when teachers genuinely cared about their students' welfare. He'd incorporated our story into his curriculum about civic engagement and standing up to injustice, always with our permission and in age-appropriate ways. "Your case changed how I think about the responsibility teachers have," he told his students each year. "We're not just here to deliver content, we're here to protect and nurture the people in our care." Jessica had pursued a career in psychology, specializing in trauma therapy for children and adolescents. Her personal experience with teacher-inflicted trauma gave her unique insight into helping young clients who'd been harmed by adults they trusted. She'd developed innovative treatment protocols specifically for students who'd experienced abuse or neglect in educational settings. Her research had been published in peer-reviewed journals and was being used by therapists across the country. "Understanding what we went through helps me connect with clients who've had similar experiences," she explained. "They need to know that someone believes them and that their trauma is valid, even if it happened at school." Tyler had become an advocate for students with disabilities, partly inspired by watching Mrs. Crawford dismiss Sarah's obvious distress as psychosomatic. He worked for a non-profit that helped families navigate special education law and fight for appropriate accommodations. His work had prevented countless students from experiencing the kind of dismissive treatment we'd endured. When teachers claimed students were faking symptoms or being dramatic, Tyler was there to ensure proper medical evaluations and legal protections. Even Daniel, despite his betrayal during our crisis, had eventually come around to understanding the seriousness of what had happened. He'd reached out years later to apologize and had become a social worker focused on child protection services. "I was young and scared and I handled everything wrong," he wrote in a letter to Amanda. "I've spent years trying to make up for how I failed you all when you needed support." His work now involved investigating reports of child abuse and neglect, including cases in educational settings. He'd cited our case in several reports as an example of how institutional failures can enable individual bad actors. The broader impact of our case extended far beyond education policy. Legal scholars had written extensively about how our victory demonstrated the power of student activism and the importance of taking young people's voices seriously in institutional reform. Our case was taught in law schools as an example of effective civil rights litigation, and in education programs as a cautionary tale about the consequences of inadequate supervision and hiring practices. A documentary film crew had followed our story for several years, creating a feature-length documentary called Classroom Courage that aired on Netflix and in schools across the country. The film won several awards and brought our story to an even wider audience. Most importantly, statistical analysis showed a measurable decrease in reported teacher misconduct in states that implemented reforms based on our case. The accountability systems we'd fought for were actually working to prevent other children from experiencing what we'd endured. Mrs. Crawford, meanwhile, had struggled to rebuild any semblance of a normal life. Her conviction followed her everywhere, making employment difficult and social relationships nearly impossible. She'd moved between several states, trying to escape the reputation that preceded her. In interviews she gave years later, she continued to maintain that she'd been trying to provide authentic historical education, and that we'd overreacted to what she called a minor chemical demonstration. She showed no genuine remorse for the permanent damage she'd caused. "I was trying to teach those kids about resilience," she said in one particularly tone-deaf interview. "If they can't handle a little discomfort, how will they face real challenges in life?" The interviewer pressed her about Amanda's lung damage and Sarah's chemical burns. Those weren't minor discomforts. These were serious injuries. Mrs. Crawford's response was chilling. Kids today are too soft. A little adversity builds character. Even years later, she fundamentally didn't understand that deliberately harming children isn't education, it's abuse. Her inability to take responsibility validated our decision to fight for criminal charges rather than accepting her resignation quietly. The anniversary of our incident became an annual day of remembrance at Lincoln High School. Each year, the current student body learned about what had happened and the safety reforms that resulted from our courage to speak out. Principal Johnson, who'd initially tried to minimize the incident, had been replaced by Dr. Maria Santos, an educator who prioritized transparency and student welfare above institutional reputation. Under her leadership, Lincoln High became a model for student safety and teacher accountability. The school now had anonymous reporting systems for students to raise concerns about teacher behavior, mandatory training for faculty on recognizing abuse and trauma, and clear protocols for investigating misconduct allegations. "We can't change what happened to those students," Dr. Santos said during one anniversary assembly, "but we can honor their courage by making sure it never happens again." Amanda and I were invited back to speak at the 10-year anniversary assembly. Standing at the podium where Mrs. Crawford had once announced her historical preservation lesson, Amanda addressed the current students with a message of empowerment. "You have more power than you realize," she told them. "When adults fail to protect you, you can protect each other. When institutions try to silence you, you can demand to be heard. When people tell you that abuse is normal or character building, you can refuse to accept that." I added my own perspective about the importance of documentation and speaking truth to power. Take pictures, save text messages, write down what happened. Truth has power, but only if people know about it. The students listened intently, many of them taking notes. In the Q&A session afterward, several asked about how to report concerning teacher behavior and what their rights were if they felt unsafe in a classroom. Their questions showed that our message was getting through. These students understood that they didn't have to accept harmful treatment just because it came from an authority figure. They knew they had rights and resources to protect themselves. Walking through the renovated hallways after the assembly, Amanda and I reflected on how far we'd all come. The physical scars and ongoing medical needs were permanent reminders of what we'd endured, but they'd also become symbols of our refusal to be silenced. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd just taken that first settlement offer and stayed quiet," Amanda mused as we passed the memorial plaque that honored our courage. "Other kids would have gotten hurt," I replied without hesitation. "Mrs. Crawford would have found another teaching job somewhere else, and the cycle would have continued." That was the truth we'd learned through our long fight for justice. Institutional problems don't solve themselves. They require people willing to stand up, speak out, and fight back even when it's difficult and painful. Our Destroyed History project had taught us more about resistance and courage than any textbook ever could have. We'd learned that real historical change happens when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice and demand better from the institutions that shape their lives. Mrs. Crawford had tried to teach us about suffering and resilience by causing us to suffer. Instead, she'd taught us that resilience means fighting back against those who would harm us and working to ensure they can't harm others. The chemical burns had healed, though scars remained. The lung damage was permanent but manageable. The psychological trauma had been processed through years of therapy and mutual support. But the most lasting effect of that horrible day was positive. The knowledge that we had power, that our voices mattered, and that fighting for justice, even when it was hard, even when it took years, was always worth it. Standing in that renovated hallway 10 years later, surrounded by safety protocols we'd helped create and memorial plaques that honored our courage, Amanda and I knew that Mrs. Crawford had failed in her ultimate goal. She tried to break us, to teach us to accept harmful treatment without complaint. Instead, she'd forged us into advocates who would spend our lives protecting other students from dangerous educators. The destroyed diorama had been replaced by something far more powerful, a network of laws, policies, organizations, and awareness that would protect children for generations to come. Mrs. Crawford's legacy was one of harm and trauma. Our legacy was one of courage, justice, and systemic change that made schools safer for everyone. In the end, the students had won. Not just our lawsuit or our criminal case, but the larger battle for the principle that children deserve to be safe in their classrooms and that adults who harm them will be held accountable. That was a lesson worth fighting for, and a victory that would echo through educational halls for decades to come. If you've made it this far through our story, thank you for listening. Sometimes the most important history lessons are the ones we write ourselves by refusing to let injustice stand unchallenged. Mrs. Crawford thought she was teaching us about the past. Instead, she taught us how to change the future, and that's a lesson no one can ever take away from us.